Hi, I'm Melissa Bિլալը. I'm a sociocultural anthropologist and historian with a specific training in music and sound studies. When I was asked to talk about how to study music and the city, ideas started popping up in my mind about the multiple ways in which I could approach this broad question. For example, this topic would immediately bring to an ethnomusicologist's mind the concept of a music scene. A music scene is a concept developed by popular music and jazz scholars to examine the socio-economic and political processes that lead to the creation of a musical cultural space in a certain location, generally in an urban environment. This is one approach to the topic of music and the city. There are other ways. For example, certain genres were born in specific urban spaces. Certain repertoires are closely associated with migration experience to or from a city. Certain genres carry styles across cities and get restyled in these new urban contexts. To give a few examples, one can think of New Orleans and jazz, Lisbon and fado, Smyrna, Piraeus, and Repetico. One can also study the city in music. Think about all the songs about Yerevan. What do they tell us about this city? From Baruch Sevak and Edgar Ovanesyan's Yerevan Erepuni, which I learned and sang growing up in Istanbul years before my first visit to Yerevan, to Aram Dikran's Bu Hasrete Yerivane in Kurdish. One can also study the politics of urbanism and music. For example, the 19th century opera, both in terms of opera house as an architectural symbol of modernity and colonialism in certain contexts, and all the themes of many grand operas. One other thing that comes to my mind when I think about the term urban is the conceptualization of rural versus urban music as two mutually exclusive and opposing categories. The idea of folk being rural and pure versus urban popular repertoires being mixed with so-called foreign elements. Or simply urban highbrow music versus lowbrow peasant music. Obviously, these are all false contrasts, but persisted for a long time in music scholarship and was a major definitive way of categorizing repertoires. In fact, the very effort of collecting and defining and classifying the folk, this obsession with the rural, or what is considered to be rural by the urban elite, itself is an urban phenomenon and historically started with the anxieties of urbanization. In this short video, I obviously cannot give you a comprehensive review of the scholarship on music and the city. So what I will do instead is first share some snapshots from my own research, which focuses on music and the city, which is Istanbul, from the perspectives of memory. I'm interested in how soundscapes affect us sensually and how we develop affective reactions to them. Sound shapes our embodied and situated experiences of a place. It thus contributes to placemaking and meaning making. So in a few examples, I will try to give you a sense of this. And then I will share some research ideas about how to study the relationship between cityscape and soundscape in Yerevan. It was a warm August afternoon in 2012 when I visited an 80-year-old Sasunsi woman in Kumkapı, one of the oldest Armenian neighborhoods of Istanbul. I will name this Sasunsi Dadik Maro in this talk. Economic hardships and the harassments they endured as Armenians had forced Maro and her family to leave Sasun in 1971 and migrate to Istanbul. Because during the genocide their land was confiscated, they had ended up working as sharecroppers in other people's fields. And over the years, it had become harder and harder to sustain their living in Sasun. So they had joined the wave of migration to Istanbul in the 1970s with some other Armenian families in the region. Istanbul was safer to live as an Armenian, and there were, and there still are, functioning Armenian schools. Maro had grown up in an Armenian-speaking home, but avoided publicly using her mother tongue in order to protect herself and her children from the verbal attacks of the neighbors. She also refrained from talking about what she had heard from her mother and mother-in-law, that is, the horrific scenes they had to witness during the genocide. Maro told me that when she was young, she used to hear the laments and the weeping of the survivor women in her family, and feeling their pain, she cried with them. Maro occasionally stopped our conversation to sing a love song, wedding song, revolutionary song, or a lullaby in Armenian or Kurdish.
Gerta heleb mornazis gelli murug daskazi Mishu sarer mishu sher Akçıgan anunikin kuşer Urbek hazar kuruşer Gerta meret kusarer Gerta meret kusarer Hamburgenen zankarer
Maro was one of the elderly members of my native community of Istanbul Armenians, Bosahais, with whom I conducted my ethnographic research on music and memory. Their generation was born into families of genocide survivors who continued living within the borders of Turkey. Some of them were born in Istanbul, some others were born into tiny communities that survived outside Istanbul. Those who were born outside witnessed the destruction of the last remaining marks of the Armenian existence in their towns. They lived an everyday life alongside the ruins of formerly functioning schools and churches. Many of them migrated to Istanbul at different stages of their lives. During my fieldwork, I not only listened to fragments of their life stories, but also asked them to sing songs. Both stories and songs had to be shared in the secret, in the safe space of home, windows and doors closed so that the neighbors wouldn't hear. Sometimes they told me that their parents and grandparents never told them anything about their past. Some sang songs to communicate the sense of loss when they couldn't speak. Some self-censored even their songs. But when I was lucky to hear these gems of songs, they were in various themes, languages, and styles. They moved in time and place and carried the past to the present, and those hometowns to the urban setting of Istanbul. For example, Maro's song that you heard carried Sasun to Istanbul. It brought the experiences of the older generation, especially women, to the present. Songs take on marks of lived experiences in their musical and poetic bodies. They convey these personal experiences to the listener. Many of these songs get circulated within the family or the community, and each time they are sung, they also create contexts to commemorate their previous singers. Songs sung in various Armenian parpars also document the particularities of collective life in a specific locality, the Armenian collective life. Sung in Istanbul today, these songs in local dialects that are nearly lost today retain memories of times when there was Armenian communal life in these places. They establish sonic bridges between generations in a minoritized community of Armenians whose very existence is under the strict surveillance of the state. In the everyday setting of Istanbul, these songs give life to the memory of towns and villages, and as in Maro's case, Sasun, Mush, Maratuk, the mountains of Sasun, outside Istanbul, which were once populated by Armenians, but now are not safe for Armenians to return. At the corner of this narrow street in Istanbul's Ortaköy district, right behind the local Armenian church, there used to be a building which sheltered my 8-year-old grandmother, who found refuge from her birthplace, Burunkishla village of Yozgat. According to one commonly told narrative, when in 1934 the Turkish government settled refugees from the Balkans into Armenian-owned houses in this village, with the fear that the cycle of genocidal violence will begin again, Armenians decided to leave in one night. According to another narrative, they had to migrate because of the governor, who, after a land dispute between the two communities, ordered Armenians to vacate the village immediately. In two major waves, hundreds of Armenians left their homes, lands, and belongings and traveled to the new capital, that is Ankara, to take a train to Istanbul, the only city in the country with an Armenian community strong enough to accommodate them. They arrived in Gayan, or Gayan, or Muhacirhane in Turkish. In 1934, in this building in Ortaköy, the Ortaköy Gayan, a baby girl was born to parents who had just arrived from Burunkishla. I will name her Anahit. In June 2015, I visited Anahit in Samatya, another old Armenian neighborhood of Istanbul. Anahit had never seen Burunkishla from where her expecting parents and brothers had to migrate. But she had grown up hearing their stories, which conveyed not only the horrors of the genocide and how they survived by hiding in neighboring villages, but also life in their village after the genocide, side by side with the perpetrators. I will share with you a song Anahit shared with me, a song she learned from her survivor father. I'm sure many of you have heard a version of this lament. It's called Der Zor Çöllerinde.
Dezor çöllerinden naneler biter, nanenin kokusu dünyaya yeter. Bu sefillik bize ölümden beter, dini bir uğruna giden Ermeni. Dezor çölleri çay gibi yakar, Ermeninin kanı sel gibi akar. Dini bir uğruna giden Ermeni acından ölüyor sefil Ermeni.
A few streets down Maro's apartment in Kumkapı or Anahit's apartment in Samatya, you'll find the Armenian church, the school, and the Sanus Miyutun, the alumni association. In all neighborhoods of Istanbul, you will find an Armenian church. In some of these neighborhoods, you will find a still functioning Armenian school and the alumni associations, where to this day, most of Armenian cultural activities take place. As an Armenian who grew up in Istanbul, I had this double experience of the city. That is, the public, which was Turkish, versus the private, which was Armenian. The home or the communal space. The latter, that is the Armenian, was not only absent, but also dangerous in the former, that is in the Turkish public space. The community spaces were like secret spaces that non-Armenians did not necessarily know about them. To this day, although some things have changed to the better or to the worse, it is still like while your everyday life goes on in the city you call home, you also witness the erasure of the marks of your existence. Millions living in the city around you are either totally ignorant about your past and the present in the city, they treat you like you are strangers, or they harbor hatred against you without even knowing anything about you. In such an urban context, if we think sonically, we can hear Turkey's minority regime if we listen to the hidden sounds of communal spaces and their absence in the city's soundscape. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into the history of Armenian music scene in Istanbul or the constitutive role Armenians played in the making of Istanbul's vibrant music scene for centuries, or even as Armenian music scene today as a site of continuity for the Armenian community in Istanbul, but I will give you a few examples that can help you visualize scenes. These examples come from my research, which, based on written and oral accounts I collected over years, aim to reimagine and reconstruct Armenian Istanbul from a musical point of view. One scene I have in mind is the images of pianos being thrown out of windows during the 6-7 September 1955 pogroms against non-Muslims in Istanbul. Several older women I interviewed had this vivid photographic memory of this traumatic event that they endured in their early youth. Another scene I have in mind is from July 6, 1957. Feminist writer Hayganush Mark and composer Koharik Ghazarosyan posed to the camera to immortalize a moment of creativity, happiness, and friendship. They were gathered in Ghazarosyan's apartment in Shishli in Istanbul to hear a performance of her musical compositions. The repertoire presented on that day's program included the songs Koharik wrote on Hayganush's poems. Both Koharik and Hayganush were erased from the collective memory of the city, Istanbul, until my colleague Lerna Ekmekçioğlu and I brought them back to their city. Of course, they are two of many women. Another woman we study is Anais Yevpime Avedisyan. It was December 1910. Komitas Vartabet had just moved to Bolis, Istanbul, from Echmiadzin. He was conducting a choir of 300 choristers, majority of whom were students at the local Esayan and Getronagan schools. He was accompanying them on piano and harmonium. That evening, Kusan Choir performed the repertoire of Armenian sacred and secular songs collected and arranged by Gomidas himself, who presented them on stage with introductory notes on their poetic, melodic, and rhythmic structures, with explanations on his arrangement strategies. Among the audience was Anais, the feminist writer and activist, who would write a piece in Byzantion Daily in praise of this concert. Both Komitas Vartabet and Anais had to leave Istanbul, and they both died in France. This music scene that I described and I'm trying to visualize today is from times that are not possible to bring back in Istanbul today. The sonic texture of the city, as you saw, gives us clues about the politics of gender, race, class, and the multiple intersections of axes of power. For example, have you ever listened to the many languages and dialects that are audible in the streets of Yerevan? What do they tell us about histories of migration? What do Yerevan nights sound like? How these sounds are different than daytime sounds? What does this difference tell us in terms of labor regime, in terms of gender regime? What does the changing sounds of the cityscape tell us about the change in urban life? What are the sounds that trigger the memory of traumatic experiences? What are the sounds that made us scared? I would like to end this short video with some questions about how to study Yerevan sounds. What is the sonic texture of Yerevan? What do we hear in our everyday lives in the streets of this city? When we approach this sound analytically, we learn many things about the organization of social life in and in relation to this urban space. This is one major methodological path we can take when we start thinking sonically about Yerevan. We can add many more questions to this list, and it opens up wide research roads in front of us. How does sound manifest, reinforce, or challenge power? How are Yerevan sounds regulated? What does this tell us about class, about neoliberal capitalism? How do we trace the sounds of the city to better understand the urban regeneration policies and urban injustices? When I say sound, I mean sounds of nature, for example, birds in public parks. I mean sounds of children playing in communal spaces or lack of those communal spaces. Sounds of cars, sirens, sound of public transportation, sounds of construction sites, industrial sites, street vendors, if there are any. If there are any protests, protest chants, and the sound of law enforcement. When we start listening to the city, we can also hear tensions. We can start thinking about sonic ways of resisting power, occupying urban space, disrupting hegemony with sound. Another way of decoding power is to critically think about the hegemonic discourses and practices about sound. This means thinking about the political economy of sound. What do I mean by this is to question and problematize what is considered organized sound versus noise, whose voice is stigmatized as noise. On the other hand, some urban noises are desired because they are seen as the sounds of so-called development, while other sounds, such as the sound of dissent, are labeled, marginalized, and abjected. And finally, if we move to music, we can ask the following questions. How is music mediated in urban space, or how are musical practices shaped by the dynamics of the urban life? Where do we go in Yerevan to specifically listen to certain genres and repertoires? And where do we hear music that we don't necessarily choose to listen or do not necessarily pay attention to? What is the history of sound technology in Yerevan? What is the genre that expresses Yerevan's urban experience? What is the discourse you see in tourism ads about what the musical culture of Yerevan is? What are the repertoires in languages and styles that were present historically in Yerevan's soundscape and are missing now? Who are publicly represented musicians in Yerevan billboards and statues? Obviously, we can add many more questions to this list, but to conclude, I would like to come back to my own research interest and say that one of the most important research areas that involves Yerevan and music has been the study of the ways in which the city gives new life to the musical heritage of locations in Western Armenia, such as Musaler, Mush, Sasun, Sepasti, and so on, or the historical processes within which music produced in rural contexts in both Eastern and Western Armenia became reinterpreted and canonized into the main repertoires of urban or national ensembles. This is an area of research that has been relatively more studied or has been currently studied. Last but not least, my dream project would be to work with street musicians in Yerevan, to listen to their life stories, their everyday lives as street musicians, and the repertoires that they play. I believe there is an untold story there, and it is an alternative story of this city. Thank you.